So for today's homily, I wanted to talk about perfection. Because when I was reading the gospel specifically, I found myself being, I guess you could say, triggered by it, because it kind of took me into a state of from I was raised in a different Christian tradition, and there was a lot of guilt reinforced with, there is the standard perfection. You're trying to meet it continuously. It's impossible to actually meet it. So therefore, you have to ask for forgiveness. And because of the particular tradition, there was a ton of guilt in the whole cycle. And so it took me a while and reading it multiple times before I realized that I was reading stuff into it that wasn't actually present. Because it doesn't say anything about basically I was adding the guilt thing in there myself. Because it talks about how, the world of the light is, he exists in perfection, and that we should strive towards it. And the thing that I was, I guess you could say, forgetting is that because we live in this world which isn't perfect, and because of the way it was made, can't really be perfect, trying to view this as a standard that has to be met was basically making it harder for me to process, essentially. And I realized that it's not saying you have to be perfect. It's saying that we should all be striving for something better than what is now. And that allowed me enough of a reframe that I wasn't doing this whole duality of like early childhood programming conflicting with what I know is actually true, and all of that. Yeah. And I also wanted to talk briefly about, because this world isn't perfect, essentially striving for the things that the gospel talks about, the perfectness. Because we live in an imperfect world, that's going to look like an imperfect thing. For instance, there's this whole thing with, there's a cup. Is it half full or half empty? And, there's a whole bunch of different responses I've heard. It's half full, it's half empty, it's twice as tall as it needs to be, it's half full of water and half full of air. But the one I hadn't heard, and that occurred to me some days ago, is that the glass is both half empty and half full at the same time. And I realized this because I used to call myself an optimist, but as I've gotten older and had particular experiences, I've discovered that there are some bits in my life where I've become something of a pessimist. So I can't really call myself either. And in reflecting upon this, I realized I was basically both. And I also realized, I'm reflecting on that sometimes in order to achieve the perfection that the gospel talks about, there are some instances where one or both, or one or the other or both, will lead you in that direction. Because I've seen instances in my life and in other folks that I know where they take optimism to an extreme, where they get rose-colored glasses, and then they miss red flags, and then they get, emotionally or what have you, spiritually or otherwise injured because they failed to see problematic things in somebody else that was in their life. And on the flip side, if you're a pessimist about everything, I mean, that can lead to all kinds of different stresses, and can't be great on your body to be that negative all about everything. Although I admit I have less personal experience with that one, mostly because I tend to lean towards optimism. And basically, what I'm trying to get at with all of this is that there are tools that we have in life that we can perceive as dark or negative or bad, like being a pessimist. But sometimes pessimism is what you need for your own sake. And in order to, in my case, have boundaries with people or life or whatever, mostly because I tend to be something of a people pleaser. So yeah. And it reminds me of there's one day that I had just come back from a weekend of a meditation retreat, basically. And I was going to work and I was waiting for the gate to open because I worked in a secure facility. Gas pipelines, you don't want everyone accessing those. And I was looking at, because there's a layer, 2 strings of barbed wire on the top, and I was looking at it and I was thinking in my head about how beautiful the sunlight was reflected off of the barbed wire. And then I realized that I didn't have any negative attachments to the barbed wire itself, and that usually I would. It was just a beautiful object. It didn't have any other positive or negative attachments to it based on a past experience. And so I come back to that sometimes because there are things that seem like they are one way, but because of past experiences or cultural reinforcement or name your pick. But sometimes that's not actually what it is. It is what it is in the world. And sometimes our negative or positive attachments to it are the actual capital T truth. And the other thing I wanted to mention before I wrap this up is that in the lesson, it talks about how Sophia made this formless creation, was upset because it didn't turn out how she was expecting. And she basically got help from the father to fix it, essentially. And I realized also that I tend to conflate wisdom with perfection, I guess you could say. Because in some part of my head, it's like, if you have, this is the embodiment of wisdom, and therefore she should know what to do at all times, because wisdom and right action, to me, seems like it's married. But the more I ruminate on it, the more I realize that it's kind of the opposite. She has wisdom because she's experienced a bunch of stuff. And also, having wisdom doesn't necessarily mean it translates into every other aspect. Like, for instance, even Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom in Greek mythology, she let her pride and her jealousy get the better of her when she had a contest with Arachne with weaving. So I just want to leave on this note of, if the goddesses of wisdom can screw up and get help to fix something, there's no reason why we can't do the same and stop putting expectations of perfection on ourselves.